Your wife is still alive. I met her in the warehouse. Annie's voice cut through the gallery at full force as she broke free from the crowd and ran straight toward Ethan Moore. Conversations collapsed mid-sentence. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the floor. Ethan jerked backward in reflex, his heel catching on the edge of the platform behind him. For a heartbeat, he thought he might fall. He didn't, but something inside him did. "Sir," a security guard started. "Wait," Ethan said sharply, lifting a hand. The child stopped a few feet from him. She was breathing hard, chest rising fast beneath a thin cotton dress. Her shoes were scuffed, her knees marked with faint bruises that told a story no one in this room had lived. She looked impossibly small standing beneath the lights, surrounded by polished shoes and tailored suits. Ethan stared at her, disbelief tightening his jaw. "That's not possible," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, the voice he used in boardrooms and courtrooms. "You're mistaken." Annie shook her head immediately. "I'm not." Daniel Harper stepped in smoothly, placing himself half between Ethan and the girl. "Sir, she's confused," he said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Children misunderstand things all the time." Ethan didn't look at Daniel. His eyes stayed on Annie. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said, slower now, each word deliberate. "There was an accident. She didn't survive." Annie's brows pulled together. "That's what people say," she replied. "But she's there." "There was no body," Ethan continued, as if reciting a verdict. "Search teams, reports, official statements." He paused, his throat tightening despite himself. "She's gone." Annie took a small step forward. No fear, no hesitation. "She's not gone," she said. "She's just in the warehouse." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room again. Ethan felt heat creep up the back of his neck. This was spiraling, and he knew it. Hope was a dangerous thing. He had buried it carefully, layer by layer, until it stopped screaming at him in the night. "You met someone else," he said firmly. "Someone who looks like her." "That happens." Annie shook her head harder this time. "No, it's her." "How do you know?" Ethan asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Because she cries when she thinks no one hears her," Annie said. "And because she says your name." The words landed wrong, not loudly, precisely. Daniel exhaled, irritation flickering across his face. "That's enough." "Annie, is it? You shouldn't say things like that. You don't understand the harm." "She says Ethan," Annie interrupted, her voice rising. "Sometimes she says it like she's mad. Sometimes like she's scared. And sometimes like she's trying to remember something that keeps slipping away." Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears. He forced a breath in through his nose. "That name is public," he said. "Anyone could know it." "She knows other things," Annie replied quickly, as if she had been waiting for him to say that. Ethan crossed his arms, grounding himself. "Such as?" Annie glanced around, suddenly aware of the room again. Then she leaned forward slightly and spoke anyway. "She says you hate the cold," Annie said. "She says you never wear gloves even when it's snowing, and she always had to put them in your coat pocket." A sharp stillness moved through Ethan's body. "That's not unusual," he said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "She says you burn toast every Sunday," Annie continued, warming to the memory, "and you pretended you liked it so she wouldn't make another batch." Someone behind Ethan let out a quiet gasp. Daniel's smile faltered. Ethan felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. Those were not stories anyone knew. Not the press, not the board, not even Daniel. "You're guessing," Ethan said. "You're repeating things someone told you." Annie shook her head again, slower this time. "She told me," she said, "when we sit on the crates, she gets tired a lot. Sometimes she forgets where she is. Sometimes she thinks she's somewhere else." Ethan's mind raced despite himself. "Where does she work?" he asked. "She cleans the paintings," Annie answered. "The old ones you don't show. She wipes the frames and talks to them like they're people." Daniel stepped closer to Ethan, lowering his voice. "Sir, this is getting out of hand. We can address it privately." Ethan barely heard him. His gaze was locked on Annie. "What does she look like?" he asked. Annie didn't hesitate. "She has a little scar under her hairline," she said, lifting her own hand to demonstrate. "From when she fell on the stairs a long time ago. She touches it when she's nervous." Ethan's breath caught. No medical report had ever mentioned that scar. It wasn't visible unless you knew where to look. He remembered kneeling on the bathroom floor years ago, holding Lillian's head while she laughed and told him she was fine, that he was overreacting. "She wears a ring," Annie added softly. "She keeps turning it, even though it doesn't fit right anymore." The room seemed to tilt. Ethan took an involuntary step back, then stopped himself. "That's enough," he said, though the words sounded thin. "My wife is dead." Annie looked up at him, her expression serious in a way no 6-year-olds should be. "If she's dead," she said quietly, "then why does she ask me if you're still mad at her?" The question struck him like a physical blow. "Mad at her?" he repeated. Annie nodded. "She says you argued before the trip. She doesn't remember what about, just that she didn't say goodbye, right?" Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. That argument had never been in any report. No one knew about it. No one but him and the woman who had driven away that morning without turning back. When he opened his eyes again, the gallery no longer felt solid beneath his feet. "Where is she?" he asked. Daniel stiffened. "Ethan, the warehouse," Annie said quickly. "The big one, where the lights flicker. She's there right now." Ethan looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, something shifted. A thin crack. A question he hadn't allowed himself to ask. "If this is a mistake," Ethan said, his voice low, "then it ends today." Annie nodded. "It's not." "Well, banned." Ethan straightened, the room coming back into focus around him. Faces, cameras, whispers. "Clear the floor," he said. "Sir?" Daniel asked. "I'm going to the warehouse," Ethan replied, and as he said it, his body felt rigid, frozen in a way he couldn't explain, as if some part of him already knew that the truth waiting there would change everything he thought he had survived. The room did not erupt the way Ethan expected it to. There was no shouting, no sudden chaos. Instead, the gallery filled with a low, unsettled murmur, like wind moving through tall grass. People leaned toward one another, whispering behind careful hands. Phones appeared, then disappeared again, unsure whether this was something to record or something to pretend had never happened. Ethan stood still at the center of it all, his body rigid, his mind racing too fast to catch up with itself. Annie's words echoed over and over, each repetition digging deeper, loosening memories he had locked away because they hurt too much to examine. Mad at her. The argument rose uninvited, sharp and clear. He had been tired, distracted, buried in work. Lillian had stood by the door, keys in her hand, asking him to come with her, just for the drive, just to get away for a day. He had said no. He always said no. She had smiled anyway, the kind of smile that tried not to show disappointment. "Be careful," he had said. "I always am," she replied. Daniel's voice cut through his thoughts. "Ethan, listen to me." He lowered his tone, leaning closer. "This is spiraling. The press will tear this apart if you walk out with a child making claims like this. Let me handle it." Ethan turned to him slowly. Daniel's face was composed, concerned, exactly as it had been 3 years ago when he delivered the accident report, when he'd told Ethan the search teams had done everything they could. "No," Ethan said. Daniel blinked. "No? I said clear the floor," Ethan repeated. "I'm leaving." A flicker of irritation crossed Daniel's eyes before he smoothed it away. "Then let me come with you." Ethan hesitated. For years, Daniel had been the one beside him in every crisis. Habit urged him to nod. Something else, quieter but insistent, urged caution. "I'll drive," Ethan said. "You stay here." Daniel straightened. "That's not wise." Ethan met his gaze. "Neither is ignoring a child who just recited my marriage back to me." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel stepped aside. "Very well," he said. "But we'll discuss this afterward." Ethan didn't respond. He turned back to Annie. She stood exactly where she had been, hands clenched at her sides, watching him with an intensity that felt far too heavy for someone her age. "You're coming with me," Ethan said. Annie nodded once. "Okay, Ever." Her father appeared at her side, pale and shaken. "Sir," he said quickly. "I didn't know she was going to." "It's all right," Ethan interrupted. He looked at the man carefully. "You work in the storage facilities?" "Yes, sir." "Night shifts mostly. Cleaning, moving crates." Ethan nodded. "You'll come too." The man swallowed and nodded. They moved through the crowd, security falling in step without being told. As the doors closed behind them, the noise dimmed, replaced by the hollow echo of the corridor. The air felt cooler here, stripped of perfume and champagne, leaving only the faint scent of cleaning solution and concrete. The walk to the warehouse complex took longer than Ethan expected. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were approaching something that might vanish if he hurried. Annie walked slightly ahead, her small stride confident, familiar. This was not an adventure to her. It was a place she knew. "You come here often?" Ethan asked. Annie nodded. "After school. Sometimes before. And you talk to her every day?" "Most days," Annie said. "Some days she's too tired." "Too tired." The words settled heavily in Ethan's chest. The warehouse doors loomed ahead, tall and unremarkable, their paint chipped from years of use. One light above the entrance flickered faintly. Annie slowed, her confidence wavering for the first time. "She's inside," she said, quieter now. Ethan reached for the handle. His hand hovered there, suspended between past and present. If this was nothing, he would finally have proof. If it wasn't, he wasn't sure what would be left of him. The door creaked open. The air inside was cooler, thick with dust and the faint smell of old wood and varnish. Rows of covered frames lined the space, towering silhouettes under white sheets. Overhead lights hummed unevenly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. "Lillian," Ethan called before he could stop himself. The name echoed back, unanswered. Annie walked in, weaving through the rows with practiced ease. "She's over here." They reached a corner where several paintings leaned against the wall, half unwrapped. A woman sat on a low stool, a cloth draped over her knee, her back turned. She was wiping the edge of a frame with slow, careful movements, as if the task required her full concentration. Ethan's heart began to pound. The woman turned at the sound of footsteps. Her face was thinner than he remembered, paler. Lines traced her features that hadn't been there before, but her eyes, confused, searching, were unmistakable. He stopped breathing. "Hello," she said uncertainly. Her voice was softer, but it was her voice. "Are you looking for someone?" The world narrowed to that single moment. Ethan felt his knees weaken, his body locking up as if movement might shatter the fragile reality forming in front of him. "Lillian," he whispered. She frowned slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. "Do I know you?" The question hurt more than the confirmation ever could have. If this moment moved, you take a second to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you are watching from. And if you want more stories about truth, loss, and quiet justice, don't forget to subscribe to Expector10.com, the channel, and stay with us for what comes next. Annie stepped forward. "It's okay," she told the woman gently. "This is Ethan. I told you he'd come." Lillian looked between them, her brow furrowing. "Ethan," she repeated slowly, tasting the name. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the ring on her finger, twisting it back and forth. "That name feels important." Ethan forced himself to move. He took one careful step closer, then another, afraid to rush her, afraid to scare her away. "It's all right if you don't remember," he said quietly. "I'm here, is she?" Her eyes filled with tears she didn't seem to understand. "I don't know why," she said, her voice breaking. "But when I see you, it feels like I forgot something I was never supposed to forget." Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the truth was undeniable, solid, and terrifying. His wife was alive. Somewhere behind him, a phone buzzed. Security shifted uneasily. Annie watched the two adults with solemn satisfaction, as if a long-held secret had finally been placed where it belonged. Ethan straightened slowly, every muscle tight, his mind already moving beyond the shock. 3 years. Someone had taken 3 years from them, and he was going to find out who. Ethan did not remember deciding to sit down, but suddenly he was on a wooden crate, elbows braced on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles burned. The warehouse felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the truth itself had weight. Lillian stood a few feet away, uncertain, clutching the cleaning cloth like a lifeline. She kept glancing at Annie, then back at Ethan, as though the child were the only solid point in the room. "I'm sorry," Lillian said again. "I feel like I should know you. That scares me." "It's all right," Ethan replied. He forced his voice to remain steady, though every word scraped against his chest. "You don't have to apologize. None of this is your fault." Annie's father hovered near the entrance, shifting from foot to foot. He looked as if he might bolt at any moment. Ethan noticed him for the first time and straightened. "How long has she been working here?" Ethan asked. The man hesitated. "A few months, sir. She was brought in through a subcontractor." "Temporary help. Who hired her?" Ethan pressed. "I don't know," the man admitted. "Paperwork came from upstairs. Everything does. Upstairs." Ethan felt a chill run through him. He turned back to Lillian. "Do you remember how you got here?" She shook her head slowly. "I remember pieces," she said. "A road, trees, rain on the windshield." Her hand moved to her temple, fingers pressing lightly as if trying to hold something in place. Then, nothing for a long time. When I woke up, I was somewhere else. A room, white walls, people asking me questions I couldn't answer. Ethan swallowed. "A hospital? Maybe," Lillian said. "They didn't tell me much. They called me by a different name." She looked embarrassed, as if this were a personal failing. "They said I'd been in an accident, that I should be grateful to be alive." Annie nodded vigorously. "She doesn't like loud noises," she added. "They make her hold her head." "Eris." Lillian smiled faintly at the girl. "You're very observant." Ethan watched the exchange, something twisting painfully in his chest. 3 years ago, Lillian had been the observant one, the person who noticed what others missed. The irony tasted bitter. "Who pays you?" Ethan asked her gently. "I'm not sure," Lillian replied. "My checks are already deposited when I get them. Someone told me not to worry about it. Just to work." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, the shock had settled into something colder, sharper. Someone had hidden her. Not lost her. Not misplaced her. Hidden her. "Ethan," Daniel's voice echoed from the doorway. Ethan turned slowly. Daniel stood just inside the warehouse, his expression carefully neutral, eyes flicking from Lillian to Annie and back again. For the first time, he looked unsure of his footing. "You shouldn't be here," Daniel said. "This is restricted." Ethan rose to his feet. He felt strangely calm now, as if his body had finally accepted what his mind was still catching up to. "She's my wife," he said. "I go wherever she is." Daniel took a step forward. "She's not well," he said carefully. "You can see that. This situation needs to be handled quietly, professionally." "Quietly," Ethan repeated. "Yes," Daniel said, "for her sake, and yours." Ethan studied him. Every memory of the past 3 years suddenly felt suspect, as if they were photographs taken at the wrong angle. "How did she end up on my payroll?" Ethan asked. Daniel paused. "Just a fraction of a second too long. It was approved during the restructuring. You delegated." "I don't delegate hiring for storage cleaners," Ethan said flatly. Silence spread between them. Lillian looked from one man to the other, confusion deepening. "Am I in trouble?" she asked softly. "No," Ethan said immediately. He turned back to her, softening his tone. "You're safe." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Ethan, you're not thinking clearly." "I've never been more clear," Ethan replied. Annie stepped closer to Lillian, taking her hand without asking. Lillian let her. The sight did something to Ethan, something final. "Call my private security team," Ethan said to the guard behind him. "And a doctor. A real one." Daniel's composure cracked. "You can't just—" "I own this building," Ethan said. "And every contract tied to it. If you want to stop me, you'll need more than words." Daniel stared at him, then exhaled slowly. "You're making a mistake." Ethan met his gaze. "If so, it's mine to make." Minutes passed in tense silence. Lillian sat back down, visibly exhausted. Annie remained by her side, talking softly about small things, the color of the paintings, the way dust sparkled in the light. Ethan watched them, committing every detail to memory, afraid that if he looked away, this too might vanish. When the doctor arrived, he spoke gently, explaining that Lillian had likely suffered a traumatic brain injury, memory loss, disorientation, symptoms that could improve with proper care she clearly had not been receiving. "We'll need to run tests," the doctor said, "and she should not be working in a place like this." "She won't be," Ethan replied. Daniel said nothing. As they prepared to leave, Lillian looked back at the warehouse one last time. "I don't know who I was," she said quietly, "but I think I was someone who trusted the wrong person." Ethan felt the weight of that sentence settle into his bones. "You're going to remember," he said, "and so am I." As they walked out into the evening air, Ethan glanced back once. Daniel was still standing there, alone among the covered paintings, his face unreadable. 3 years ago, Ethan had lost his wife to an accident. Now he understood something far worse had happened. Someone had stolen her life while he was still alive. The drive away from the warehouse passed in near silence. Ethan sat in the back seat beside Lillian, close enough to feel the faint warmth of her arm through the thin fabric of her sleeve. She stared out the window, watching the city slide by as if it belonged to another lifetime. Annie sat across from them, her legs swinging slightly, eyes moving between Ethan and Lillian with quiet vigilance. Ethan noticed everything now, the way Lillian flinched when a truck honked too loudly, the way she pressed her palm against the door when the car slowed suddenly. Trauma lived in the body long after the mind forgot its reasons. "We're going somewhere safe," Ethan said softly, more to reassure himself than her. "Just for tonight." Lillian nodded without looking at him. "I trust you," she said after a moment, then hesitated. "I think," the words cut deeper than any accusation could have. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. They arrived at a private medical residence on the edge of the city, a place Ethan had funded years ago for executives recovering from stress-related conditions. He had never imagined bringing his wife here under circumstances like this. Staff members moved quickly, efficiently, their professionalism calm but alert. Lillian was guided gently inside, Annie refusing to let go of her hand until a nurse smiled and promised she could stay nearby. Ethan pulled Annie's father aside. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. The man nodded, eyes glossy. "She talks too much sometimes," he said, half apologetic, half proud. "She talks exactly enough," Ethan replied. As Lillian was settled into a private room, Ethan stood just outside the door, listening to the soft beeping of monitors, the murmur of voices. 3 years ago, he had been denied this sound. 3 years ago, the door had closed without explanation. Daniel appeared at the end of the hallway. "I wondered how long it would take," he said. Ethan turned slowly. "For what?" "For you to start questioning everything," Daniel replied. His voice was controlled, but something brittle lay beneath it. "You should have trusted me." "I did," Ethan said. "With my company. With my grief." He paused. "With my wife." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're emotional. Understandable, given the shock. But this needs to be managed carefully." "Carefully," Ethan repeated again. "Like she was?" Daniel stepped closer. "Lillian wasn't supposed to survive," he said quietly. The words landed with a dull, horrifying clarity. Ethan felt his hands tremble, but his voice remained steady. "Say that again." Daniel exhaled, as if relieved to finally speak freely. "The accident was meant to remove a problem. She knew things, Ethan. Things that could have destroyed everything you built." "You mean everything you took?" Ethan said. Daniel's eyes flashed. "I protected this company. You protected yourself." Silence stretched between them, thick and dangerous. "You're not leaving this building," Ethan said. Daniel smiled thinly. "You underestimate how many systems I control." Ethan met his gaze. "You underestimate how many I do." Security stepped into the hallway, answering a signal Ethan had sent minutes earlier. Daniel glanced at them, his composure finally cracking. "This isn't over," Daniel said. Ethan didn't respond. He turned back to the door where Lillian rested, Annie sitting beside her bed, holding her hand like a promise. Inside that room, a stolen life was beginning again, and Ethan knew now, with absolute certainty, that justice would not come quietly. Morning came slowly, filtered through half-drawn blinds and the low hum of machines. Ethan had not slept. He sat in the chair beside Lillian's bed, jacket folded over the back, tie loosened, eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of her chest, as if the rhythm itself were a promise that could still be broken. Lillian slept fitfully. Sometimes her brow creased, sometimes her fingers twitched, brushing against the sheet as though searching for something just out of reach. When she stirred, Ethan leaned forward instinctively, ready to speak, ready to anchor her if she drifted too far into confusion again. Annie lay curled on the couch near the window, shoes neatly lined up beneath it, exhaustion finally claiming her. A nurse had tried to move her earlier, but Lillian had grown visibly distressed at the suggestion, so they had let the child stay. Ethan had silently approved. Annie had earned her place in this room. A soft knock came at the door. Ethan rose and stepped into the hallway, closing it gently behind him. Two men waited there, his chief of security and a private investigator he trusted. Both looking alert, grim. "They took Daniel into custody for questioning," the investigator said quietly. "Not an arrest, not yet." "Yet," Ethan echoed. "The problem," the man continued, "is that his fingerprints are nowhere near the accident scene. The paperwork is clean. Too clean." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then he didn't do it himself. I would owe." "No," the investigator agreed. "He had help." Ethan leaned against the wall, folding his arms.
You have to trust me.
"I want everything reopened.
I won't let
The
anything
accident,
happen to her.
the contracts, every subcontractor hired in the last 3 years. I don't care how deep you have to dig." The investigator hesitated. "This will get ugly." Ethan's voice was flat. "It already is." Inside the room, Lillian stirred. Ethan stepped back in immediately. Her eyes were open now, unfocused at first, then slowly finding him. "You're still here," she said. "I told you I wouldn't leave." Ethan replied. She studied his face as if comparing it to something faintly remembered. "You look tired." "I am," he admitted. "But that's all right." Lillian glanced around the room, taking in the unfamiliar setting. The machines, the child asleep on the couch. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. "No," Ethan said firmly. He pulled a chair closer and sat so they were level. "Someone did something wrong to you." She frowned. "I don't remember." "You don't have to," he said gently. "Not yet." Her hand moved under the sheet, fingers brushing against his. The contact was tentative, uncertain, but real. Ethan's breath caught despite his effort to remain calm. "I feel like I trusted someone," Lillian said slowly. "And I shouldn't have." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. "You did nothing wrong," he repeated. "Trust isn't a crime." Her gaze drifted to Annie. "That little girl," she murmured. "She keeps me from feeling lost." Ethan nodded. "She does that." Later that day, the doctors confirmed what Ethan already suspected. Lillian's memory loss was consistent with trauma compounded by prolonged neglect. With proper care, parts of her memory might return, or they might not. There were no guarantees. "I don't need guarantees," Ethan said. "I need accountability." By afternoon, word had begun to spread. Not publicly, not yet, but inside the company. Whispers moved fast. Board members requested meetings. Legal counsel sent messages marked urgent. Ethan ignored them all. Instead, he sat with Annie at a small table in the residence cafeteria, watching her carefully spoon soup without spilling a drop. "You were very brave," he said. Annie shrugged. "I just told the truth." "That's not easy," Ethan replied, "especially when no one wants to hear it." She looked up at him. "She wanted me to tell you." Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. She was right. Annie hesitated. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan considered the question. "She's alive," he said. That's a start. Annie nodded, satisfied with the answer. That evening, Ethan finally took a call from a federal agent assigned to the case. We've traced payments, the agent said. Shell companies, off-the-books accounts. Your partner was funding something he didn't want tied to him. A facility? Ethan asked. A private recovery center. Remote. Not licensed. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's where she was. Yes, the agent confirmed. For nearly a year. After that, she was moved. Moved, like an object. Like a liability. Charges? Ethan asked. We're building them. The agent said. Attempted murder. Fraud. Conspiracy. But we need one thing. What? Your testimony. Ethan didn't hesitate. You'll have it. That night, as the residence quieted and lights dimmed, Ethan returned to Lillian's bedside. She was awake, watching the darkened window. I remembered something, she said softly. Ethan leaned forward. What is it? A voice, Lillian said. A man telling me everything would be easier if I just signed something. Ethan's hands clenched. Did you? I don't know, she replied. But I remember being afraid. Ethan swallowed hard. You don't have to remember anymore tonight. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something shifted behind her eyes. You waited, she said. Not a question. A realization. Yes, Ethan replied. I did. She reached for his hand, holding it this time with purpose. I'm sorry. For what? He asked. For leaving without saying goodbye. Ethan felt his vision blur. We have time, he said. All the time they tried to take from us. Outside the room, security guards stood watch. Phones buzzed with updates. Somewhere, Daniel Harper sat alone, facing the slow collapse of a story he had thought complete. Inside, a family that had been broken began, quietly, to exist again. The house settled into a quiet that felt unfamiliar to Ethan. Not the hollow silence he had lived with for 3 years, but something more fragile, more tentative, like a room holding its breath. Lillian slept again, this time more peacefully, her hand resting open on the sheet as if she no longer feared losing what was there when she closed her eyes. Ethan sat nearby, reviewing files on his tablet, the glow casting sharp shadows across his face. Financial records, internal approvals, layers of signatures that led, again and again, back to Daniel Harper. Everything Daniel had done had been legal on the surface, clean enough to pass audits, reasonable enough to avoid suspicion. That, Ethan realized, had been the point. A soft movement caught his attention. Annie had slipped off the couch and padded quietly across the room, careful not to wake Lillian. She climbed onto the chair beside Ethan without asking. You look angry, she said. Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the accuracy. I am, he admitted. But not at you, she nodded as if that distinction mattered. You're angry at the man who lied. Yes, and at yourself, Annie added. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at the screen, then shut the tablet off. Why do you say that? Annie shrugged. Because you didn't know. Grown-ups don't like it when they don't know things. Ethan let out a quiet breath. You're right. Annie swung her legs gently. She talks in her sleep, she said, nodding toward Lillian. What does she say? Your name, Annie replied. And sometimes she says, don't sign. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Later that morning, the investigator returned with more updates. Ethan stepped into the hallway to listen, closing the door softly behind him. We found the facility she was taken to after the accident, the investigator said. Unregistered, operating under a charitable license that doesn't actually exist. Who signed the transfer? Ethan asked. A proxy, the investigator replied. Someone authorized through your office. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Daniel again. Always Daniel. And the warehouse? Ethan asked. A holding point, the investigator said. Low visibility, minimal staff, no oversight. Whoever put her there assumed she'd stay invisible. They didn't count on a child, Ethan said. No, the investigator agreed. They didn't. When Ethan returned to the room, Lillian was awake, propped slightly against her pillows. She looked stronger today, more present. though confusion still lingered behind her eyes. "I was thinking," she said. "That can be dangerous," Ethan replied gently. A faint smile touched her lips. "I think I used to argue with you." Ethan chuckled despite himself. "You did. About important things? And unimportant ones," he said. "Mostly about how much you gave away to people who didn't deserve it." She frowned thoughtfully. "Did I?" "Yes," Ethan said. "And I loved you for it." Her smile faded into something more serious. "The man you were talking to," she said slowly. "Daniel. He was around before the accident." Ethan's posture stiffened. "You remember him?" "Not clearly," Lillian admitted. "But I remember feeling uneasy. Like he was always standing too close." Ethan nodded. "You trusted your instincts." "One. I didn't trust them enough," she said quietly. He reached for her hand. "You trusted the wrong person." "That happens." She looked at him then, searching. "Did I sign something that hurt you?" Ethan hesitated. He could lie. He could soften the truth. Instead, he chose honesty. "I don't know yet," he said. "But even if you did, it wasn't your fault." Lillian closed her eyes, a tear slipping free. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why this ends differently. I was no tenant." By afternoon, arrangements were made. Lillian would be transferred to a long-term care facility under Ethan's direct supervision. Annie's father was placed on paid leave, quietly reassured that his job and his daughter's safety were secure. Annie herself refused to leave Lillian's side. "She needs me," Annie said simply. Ethan considered the girl for a long moment. "She does," he agreed. As evening approached, Ethan received a call from the board. This time, he answered. "We need clarity," one voice said. "Rumors are spreading." "Then listen carefully," Ethan replied. "My wife is alive. She was hidden using company resources without my consent. Anyone involved will be held accountable." A stunned silence followed. "This will destabilize everything," another voice warned. Ethan's response was calm, final. "So be it." When the call ended, Ethan felt strangely lighter. The mask he had worn for years was finally slipping away. That night, he sat beside Lillian again, watching Annie draw quietly at the small table by the window. The child hummed softly, a tune without words. "Do you think she'll remember everything?" Lillian asked. "I don't know," Ethan said. "But she remembers what matters." Lillian nodded. "She remembers kindness." Ethan watched Annie for a long moment. "She reminds me that truth doesn't always come from power," he said. "Sometimes it comes from courage." Lillian squeezed his hand. "Then promise me something. Anything. Don't let them make her invisible again." Ethan looked at Annie, then back at Lillian. "I won't." Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one. Somewhere, investigations deepened. Evidence gathered. Stories unraveled. But inside that room, something steadier was taking shape. A resolve built not on anger alone, but on responsibility. 3 years ago, Ethan had lost everything he thought defined him. Now, with truth finally breaking the surface, he understood that what came next would define him far more. The news broke the next morning, despite every attempt to contain it. Ethan was standing by the window of Lillian's room when his phone began vibrating non-stop on the table. He didn't need to look to know what it was. The city moved fast when it smelled scandal, and this one carried money, betrayal, and a woman presumed dead returning to life. Those stories never stayed quiet for long. He picked up the phone anyway. "Ethan," his attorney said without preamble, "we have a situation." Beckett. Ethan watched a gull land on the railing outside, then lift off again. "Go on." A staff member at the exhibition spoke to a reporter. "Not by name, but enough details are out. They're asking questions about Daniel Harper and unauthorized use of company assets." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Then, it's begun." "Yes," the attorney replied. "And it will escalate." After the call ended, Ethan didn't move right away. He stayed by the window, grounding himself in the ordinary rhythm of the morning, the hum of traffic, the distant siren, the sound of Annie's laughter drifting faintly from the hallway as she argued with a nurse about whether crayons counted as medical supplies. Behind him, Lillian stirred. "They're talking about us, aren't they?" she asked. Ethan turned. "They will be." She sat up slowly, winced, then steadied herself. "I don't like the idea of strangers knowing my life." "Izo, I won't let them touch you," Ethan said. "Not like that." Lillian studied his face. "You're preparing for a fight." "Yes," he said, "but not the kind that ends quickly." Later that morning, federal agents arrived with warrants. They were polite, professional, relentless. They asked Lillian gentle questions, careful not to push her beyond what she could manage. Annie stayed close, one small hand always touching Lillian's sleeve, anchoring her to the present. Ethan watched the process with a growing sense of clarity. This was no longer about shock or reunion. It was about exposure. "Mr. Moore," one of the agents said quietly, stepping aside with him, "we've secured records tying Harper to multiple shell companies. But there's something else." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What?" "He wasn't acting alone," the agent said. "There are at least 2 other executives who benefited from your absence. Decisions made while you were impaired by grief." Ethan nodded. He had suspected as much. "Then bring them all into the light." By midday, Daniel Harper was formally arrested. Ethan received the confirmation while sitting with Annie in the common room. She was coloring carefully, tongue pressed against her lip in concentration. "They took the bad man?" she asked, not looking up. "Yes," Ethan replied. Annie nodded once. "Good. You're very calm about all this," Ethan observed. She shrugged. "I told the truth. That's all I had to do. I have to weigh." Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Truth, he realized, was only simple for those with nothing to lose. That afternoon, he made his first public statement in 3 years. The room was small. No grand stage, no donors. Just cameras, microphones, and the quiet gravity of what he was about to say. "My wife, Lillian Moore, is alive," Ethan said. "She was the victim of a deliberate act designed to remove her and destabilize my company. I failed to see it. I trusted someone I should not have." A reporter raised a hand. "Are you admitting negligence, Mr. Moore?" "I'm admitting responsibility," Ethan replied evenly. "There's a difference." Another voice cut in. "What about the child?" Ethan didn't hesitate. A 6-year-old girl saw what powerful adults chose to ignore. "Without her, my wife would still be invisible. Let that be the lesson." The statement ended there. No questions, no apologies. Ethan left the room knowing the world would dissect every word anyway. When he returned to the residence, Lillian was resting, her face calmer than he had seen it yet. Annie sat nearby, listening to an audiobook through one earbud, the other dangling loose. "You did good," Annie said when she saw him. Ethan smiled faintly. "So did you." That evening, Lillian woke from a short nap, her expression distant. "I remembered something else," she said quietly. Ethan sat immediately. "What is it?" "A document," Lillian said. "Daniel wanted me to sign it. He said it was for the company. He said you were too overwhelmed to deal with it." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Do you remember what it was?" "Control," she said softly. "Temporary," he said. "Just until things settled." Ethan closed his eyes. That was the missing piece. The legal justification. The reason Daniel had been able to move so freely. "I refused," Lillian continued. "That's when everything changed." Etecular. Ethan reached for her hand. "You saved more than you know." Her grip tightened around his. "I just wish I'd known how much it would cost." As night fell, Ethan stood alone in the hallway, staring at the darkened window. The city lights below looked different now, not distant, not abstract, but connected to him again. Annie patted up beside him. "You look like you're thinking too hard," she said. "I probably am," Ethan replied. She considered him for a moment. "My dad says when people lie for too long, the truth gets heavy. That's why it falls so loud." Ethan smiled. "A real one this time. Your dad sounds wise." Annie shrugged. "He listens." Ethan looked back toward Lillian's room, then down at the child beside him. Somewhere between the woman who had survived and the child who had spoken, His life had shifted onto a new path. The storm was far from over. Courts, trials, public judgment, all of it lay ahead. But the silence that had ruled his life for 3 years was finally gone, and in its place stood something far more dangerous to those who had wronged him: the truth. By the third day, the residence no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a command center. Ethan sat at the long dining table that had been repurposed into a temporary operations hub. Legal folders stacked beside a half-eaten plate of eggs gone cold. Screens glowed with timelines, financial charts, and scanned documents. Names appeared and reappeared, executives he had trusted, signatures he had approved without question, decisions made while grief had dulled his instincts. Across the room, Lillian sat wrapped in a light cardigan, a nurse nearby but unobtrusive. She watched Ethan quietly, absorbing his intensity with a mix of admiration and unease. "You haven't stopped since yesterday," she said. Ethan didn't look up. Neither did they. That morning, the investigator had delivered a preliminary reconstruction of the past 3 years. It wasn't a single betrayal. It was a sequence: small shifts, quiet approvals, decisions framed as temporary. Daniel had not seized control overnight. He had waited. He had let Ethan drown slowly in loss, then offered solutions that felt like relief. "You were grieving," the investigator had said. He exploited that. Now, Ethan traced a finger along a document authorizing a subsidiary's restructuring. His signature sat at the bottom. Real. Legal. Damning. Annie wandered into the room carrying a paper cup of orange juice. She stopped beside Lillian and whispered something that made Lillian smile faintly. Then she turned her attention to Ethan. "Are you still looking at the bad man's papers?" Annie asked. "Yes," Ethan replied. "Do they tell you why he did it?" Ethan paused. "They tell me how," he said. "Why is harder." Annie thought about that. Grown-ups do bad things when they think no one small is watching. The simplicity of it landed harder than any legal brief. That afternoon, Ethan made a decision that would change the trajectory of the case. He called a press conference not for spectacle, but for control. He knew now that silence would only allow others to shape the narrative. Lillian watched him prepare from the doorway. "You don't have to do this today," she said. "Yes," Ethan replied gently. "I do." The press room was fuller this time. Faces he recognized, others he didn't. Cameras clicked as he stepped forward, the hum of anticipation loud enough to feel. "I won't repeat what's already been said," Ethan began. "But I will add this. My wife was not lost. She was removed. And that did not happen without help." A reporter leaned forward. "Are you accusing members of your own board?" "I'm stating facts," Ethan replied. "And facts will be proven." Another voice called out. "Why didn't you notice sooner?" Ethan met the question head on. "Because grief makes you blind, and because I trusted the wrong people." There was a pause. Then another question. "And the child?" Ethan didn't hesitate. Annie did what no adult in that room did. She spoke when it was uncomfortable. "That matters." The statement rippled through the room. Ethan could feel the shift. This was no longer just a corporate scandal. It was a moral one. Back at the residence, Lillian was quieter than usual. She sat by the window, fingers resting against the glass. "Do you remember the mountain?" Ethan asked her carefully. She closed her eyes. "Pieces," she said. "The road was narrow. I remember thinking I should turn back." Ethan's chest tightened. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was angry," Lillian said. "And because I trusted the person who told me everything would be fine." "Daniel," Ethan said. She nodded. "He said you needed time. That I was making things harder." Ethan swallowed. "You were protecting us." Lillian looked at him, something clearer in her gaze now. "I think I knew that if I signed those papers, I would disappear. Not just from the company, from you." Ethan felt the weight of that realization settle heavily, and they tried to make that true. That night, the investigator returned with new information. "We found the original accident report," he said. "It was amended. After the fact." Ethan straightened. "By whom?" "A consultant paid through one of Harper's accounts. Regnus." The picture sharpened. This had never been an accident gone wrong. It had been an operation that failed to finish the job. Annie listened quietly from the floor, drawing shapes on a notepad. "Does that mean she wasn't supposed to come back?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said softly. Annie frowned. "Then they're going to be very mad." Ethan considered the child for a long moment. "They already are." Later, when the house had finally settled, Ethan sat alone in the study. The lights dimmed. For the first time since Lillian's return, the magnitude of what lay ahead pressed fully into him. Trials, testimony, public judgment, enemies who would not disappear quietly. He thought of the night Lillian had driven away, of the words he hadn't said, of the years he had lost believing he had no right to hope. The door opened softly. Lillian stepped in. "I remember something else," she said. Ethan stood immediately. "What is it?" "The warehouse," she said. "I wasn't sent there by accident. Someone told me it would be temporary, that once things settled, I'd be moved somewhere safer. And instead," Ethan said, "and instead I was forgotten." Lillian finished. He took her hands gently. "Not anymore." She looked at him, steady now. "You're going to take them down." "Yes," Ethan said, "but not alone." She nodded, accepting that. From the hallway, Annie's voice drifted in, soft but certain. "You don't lose when you tell the truth. You just have to wait for it to catch up." Ethan smiled to himself. The child was right. The truth had caught up, and it was only gaining speed. The first subpoena arrived before sunrise. Ethan was already awake when his phone vibrated on the nightstand. He reached for it quietly, careful not to disturb Lillian. She slept more soundly now, her breathing deeper, steadier, as if her body was finally beginning to believe it was safe. He read the message once, then again. Federal court. Formal language. A date circled in red in his mind. So it had begun. He dressed without turning on the overhead light and stepped into the kitchen, where the coffee machine hummed softly. The familiar bitterness filled the air, grounding him. For years, mornings had meant endurance. Now they meant preparation. Annie appeared in the doorway, rubbing one eye. "You're up early again." "I never really slept," Ethan replied. She nodded, accepting this as normal. "Big day?" "Yes," he said. "For all of us." She climbed onto a chair and watched him pour coffee. "Is it the day you tell the judge the truth?" "Soon," Ethan said. "Not today, but soon." Annie considered that. Grown-ups take a long time to say things. Ethan smiled faintly. "They do." By mid-morning, the residence filled with quiet urgency. Lawyers arrived with briefcases and controlled expressions. Security checked credentials twice. The investigator spread documents across the dining table, connecting names, dates, transfers. Each line drawn was another confirmation that what had happened to Lillian was not an isolated act, but part of a deliberate dismantling. "They isolated you emotionally," the investigator said, tapping a page. "Then they isolated her physically. Classic control strategy." Ethan nodded. "And I helped by stepping away." "You were grieving," the man replied. "That's not a crime." "No," Ethan said. "But it is a vulnerability. Well, make to do." In the living room, Lillian sat with Annie, sorting through old photographs that Ethan had brought from home. Some were from before the accident. Others were newer events. Lillian had no memory of attending. "This one," Lillian said, holding up a picture of Ethan at a charity gala. "I don't remember this dress." "You weren't there," Ethan said from the doorway. "That was after." Lillian studied the image again. "You look empty." Ethan didn't argue. A knock sounded at the front door. Security stiffened. "It's all right," Ethan said. "I know who it is." Detective Morales stepped inside, rain still clinging to his coat. He had been assigned to the case 2 days earlier, and already his presence carried weight. "We recovered additional surveillance footage," Morales said, "from the mountain road." Ethan's chest tightened. "What does it show?" "Not the crash," Morales replied. "Something before it." They gathered around the screen as Morales played the clip, a dark stretch of road, headlights cutting through mist. Lillian's car slowed. Another vehicle pulled in behind her. Hazard lights flashed. Lillian leaned forward, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "That's him," she whispered. Ethan looked at her sharply. "Who?" "The man who told me to stop," she said. "He said there was something wrong with my tire." The footage froze on a figure stepping out of the other vehicle. The face was grainy, but the posture was unmistakable. Daniel Harper. The room went still. "So it wasn't just paperwork," Ethan said quietly. "No," Morales replied. "It was personal." Lillian closed her eyes. "He smiled," she said. "I remember thinking he looked relieved when I pulled over." Ethan felt something harden inside him. Not rage. Resolution. "Add attempted murder," Ethan said. Morales nodded. "Already done." By late afternoon, Ethan was summoned to his first closed-door hearing. He stood in a quiet chamber, hand raised, voice steady as he answered questions he had been avoiding for 3 years. Yes, he had delegated authority. Yes, he had signed documents without reading them closely. Yes, he had trusted Daniel Harper implicitly. "No," Ethan said clearly. "I never authorized the removal of my wife from medical care. I never consented to her being declared dead." Recording. When it was over, he stepped outside into cool air, lungs burning as if he had been holding his breath for years. That evening, as the residents settled again, Ethan found Annie sitting alone by the window, knees tucked to her chest. "Are you scared?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not now." "When were you scared?" She thought for a moment. When no one listened, Ethan sat beside her. "I'm listening now." She looked up at him. "You always were. You just didn't know it yet." "Die." The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any accusation. Later, Lillian asked to speak privately. Ethan joined her in the quiet of the bedroom, the city lights blinking faintly beyond the glass. "They're going to tell my story without me," she said. "Only if you let them," Ethan replied. She met his gaze. "I want to testify." Ethan inhaled sharply. "Lillian, you don't have to." "I know," she said. "But I should." He studied her face, searching for uncertainty. He found none. "Only resolve. Then we'll do it together," he said. She reached for his hand. "I was afraid you'd try to protect me by hiding me again." "I won't," Ethan promised. "Not from the truth." As night fell, Ethan stood alone on the balcony, the weight of the coming days pressing heavily on him. Courtrooms, cameras, lies dragged into the light. Behind him, Annie's voice drifted out. "Mr. Ethan?" "Yes?" "If they ask me what I saw," she said, "I'll tell them." "Acts." Ethan turned, meeting her steady gaze. "I know you will." For the first time, he understood something clearly. Justice wasn't arriving because he was powerful. It was arriving because someone small had refused to stay quiet. And now, it was unstoppable. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a scent Ethan associated with permanence. Decisions made here did not evaporate. They settled. They stayed. He arrived early, as he always did now. Habit had replaced hesitation. Outside the building, reporters gathered behind metal barricades, their voices blending into a low, restless hum. Cameras tracked every movement, searching for cracks, for signs of weakness. Ethan kept his gaze forward and walked through the doors without slowing. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter. Security nodded him through. His attorney fell into step beside him, murmuring last-minute reminders that Ethan barely heard. His mind was elsewhere on the woman seated 2 rooms away, preparing to tell strangers what had been done to her, and on a 6-year-old child who had unknowingly set all of this in motion. Lillian sat in a small waiting room with Annie, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair brushed back, her posture composed. She looked like herself again, or at least like a version of herself that existed before fear had hollowed her out. "You don't have to do this today," Ethan said quietly as he approached. Lillian looked up at him, calm and steady. "I know." Annie swung her legs from the chair beside her. "She practiced," the girl said. "She says it helps to tell the truth out loud before other people ask for it." Lillian smiled faintly. "Annie is a very good coach." Ethan knelt in front of the child. "If at any point this feels like too much, you can stop," he said gently. Annie tilted her head. "Why would I?" Ethan had no answer for that. He stood and took Lillian's hand instead. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "I'm here." She squeezed his fingers. "I know." The hearing room was smaller than Ethan expected. No jury yet. No dramatic speeches. Just a judge, a few attorneys, a court reporter, and the quiet gravity of sworn testimony. Daniel Harper sat at the far table, his suit immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. He did not look at Ethan. He did not look at Lillian. That, more than anything, told Ethan how frightened he was. Lillian took the stand first. Her voice was soft but clear, steady in a way that surprised even her. She spoke of the accident, of the man who had told her to pull over, of the moment everything went dark. She spoke of waking in unfamiliar rooms, of being told her name was something else, of being encouraged not to ask questions. "Did anyone tell you your husband believed you were dead?" the prosecutor asked. Lillian paused. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand. "Yes," she said. "They said it was better that way, that he would move on." Ethan felt his jaw clench. "And did you believe them?" "At first," Lillian replied. "I didn't remember enough to argue. Later, I didn't feel safe enough to try." She glanced briefly at Daniel then, not with anger, but with a kind of distant clarity. "I trusted him," she said. "He used that trust to erase me." The room was silent when she stepped down. Ethan testified next. He spoke of delegation, of grief, of the slow erosion of control that came from believing someone else would protect what mattered. He did not excuse himself. He did not dramatize his pain. He stated facts. He took responsibility where it belonged. "I failed to see what was happening," he said, "but I did not consent to it, and I will not protect those who did." When it was Daniel's turn, the air shifted. He denied intent, denied manipulation, framed his actions as necessary, as business decisions made under pressure. He spoke smoothly, confidently, as if words alone could reshape reality. Then the footage was played. The mountain road, the flashing hazard lights. Daniel's figure stepping out of the vehicle, raising a hand to signal Lillian to stop. Daniel's composure cracked. Ethan watched it happen without satisfaction. This was not victory. This was exposure. By the time the judge adjourned the session, the outcome was no longer in question. Charges would be expanded. A full trial would follow. The machinery of justice had been set in motion, and it did not reverse easily. Outside the courthouse, the crowd surged. Questions flew. Ethan raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "My wife was hidden," he said simply. "Not lost. The difference matters." He did not stay longer than that. Back at the residence, the weight of the day finally settled. Lillian sat on the couch, visibly exhausted. Ethan brought her a glass of water and sat beside her, close but careful, as if she might still disappear if he moved too quickly. "You were incredible," he said. She shook her head. "I was honest." "That's harder," he replied. Annie climbed onto the armchair opposite them, hugging her knees. "Did they listen?" "Yes," Ethan said. "They did." Annie nodded, satisfied. "Good." That night, after Lillian had gone to bed, Ethan stood alone in the study, staring at a framed photograph he had carried with him for years. The man in the picture looked composed, confident, unaware of what was coming. Ethan barely recognized him now. The phone rang. It was the investigator. "Harper's accounts are frozen," he said. "And there's something else. We found correspondence. Emails you were never meant to see." Ethan closed his eyes. "Send them." When the files arrived, he read them slowly. Plans, contingencies, discussions of removal and containment. His wife had been reduced to a problem to be managed. Ethan shut the tablet and sat back, the finality of it settling deep in his chest. This wasn't just about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about ensuring it could never happen again. He turned off the light and walked down the hall. As he passed Annie's room, he heard her voice, soft but certain, speaking to no one in particular. "Truth doesn't get tired," she said. "People do." Ethan paused, letting the words sink in. The truth wasn't finished yet, and neither was he. The emails arrived just after midnight. Ethan sat alone in the study, the house finally quiet. the kind of quiet that only comes after exhaustion has burned through adrenaline. The tablet glowed softly on the desk, illuminating his face as he scrolled line by line, each message peeling back another layer of the lie he had lived inside for 3 years. They were clinical, detached, written in the language of efficiency and risk management. She's refusing to sign. Is Ahmad. Delay extraction until more stabilizes. If memory impairment persists, relocation becomes permanent. Ethan stopped scrolling. Relocation becomes permanent. He leaned back slowly, closing his eyes as the words echoed in his head. Permanent did not mean safe. It meant erased. Behind those sentences were choices calculated, deliberate choices made by people who had eaten at his table, shaken his hand, looked him in the eye while planning how to remove his wife from existence without blood on their own. A soft knock sounded at the door. Ethan looked up. "Come in." Lillian stood there, wrapped in a light sweater, her hair slightly mussed from sleep. She looked steadier than she had days ago, but there was a quiet alertness in her eyes now, as if something inside her had shifted. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Neither could you." "No," Ethan replied. "I don't think I will for a while." She stepped inside, glancing at the tablet. "Is it bad?" "It's worse than I thought," he said honestly. He hesitated, then turned the screen toward her. "But you don't have to read it." Lillian studied his face for a moment, then shook her head. "I need to." She read slowly, lips pressing together as she moved from one message to the next. Halfway through, she stopped. "They talked about me like I wasn't a person," she said quietly. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry." She looked up at him. "You didn't do this." "No," he said. "But I let them." Lillian reached out, placing her hand over his. "You didn't know." "I should have," Ethan replied. "I should have listened when you questioned him, when you said something felt wrong." Lillian exhaled, then gave a small, sad smile. "I questioned myself too." They stood there in silence, the weight of shared regret settling between them. Not blame, not anger, just the recognition of what had been taken. In the hallway, a small sound broke the stillness. Bare feet on carpet. Annie appeared in the doorway, clutching her blanket. "You're both awake." Ethan turned toward her. "Did we wake you?" She shook her head. "Bad dreams," she said simply. Lillian knelt and opened her arms. Annie didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and hugged her, pressing her cheek against Lillian's shoulder. The gesture was natural, unforced, as if it had always been this way. "It's okay," Lillian murmured. "You're safe." Annie nodded, satisfied, then glanced at Ethan. "Is the bad man still in trouble?" "Yes," Ethan said. "More than before." Annie considered this. "Good. He shouldn't get to choose who disappears." I. The words settled heavily in the room. The next morning, the prosecution team arrived early. They sat around the table, legal pads open, voices low and focused. Ethan listened as they outlined the next steps, expanded indictments, additional witnesses, the possibility of a plea offer. "We don't recommend accepting it," the lead prosecutor said. "Not with this evidence." Ethan nodded. "I'm not interested in quiet endings." Lillian listened from the doorway, arms crossed loosely. "What about the others?" she asked. The prosecutor looked at her carefully. "We're moving on them. But we need your testimony to establish intent." Lillian met Ethan's gaze. He didn't interrupt. "I'll do it," she said. "All of it." The prosecutor nodded. "Then we proceed." After they left, Ethan found Annie in the garden, sitting cross-legged on the grass, pulling weeds with surprising seriousness. "What are you doing?" he asked. "They don't belong here," Annie said, holding up a handful of roots. "They take space from the flowers." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's true." She looked up at him. "Are you scared?" He considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said, "but not of losing anymore." Annie nodded, as if that made perfect sense. That afternoon, Ethan received word that Daniel Harper had declined a plea deal. He was confident, still clinging to the belief that influence could outlast truth. Ethan felt no satisfaction in the news, only resolve. He visited Lillian later that evening, finding her seated by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I remember more," she said quietly, without turning. Ethan sat beside her. "Tell me, the warehouse wasn't the first place," she said. "There was another building, smaller, no windows." Ethan's jaw tightened. "A holding facility." "Yes," Lillian said. "They told me it was temporary, that once you signed, everything would be easier." Ethan closed his eyes. "You saved me from something I didn't even see." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "No, we saved each other." Night fell slowly. Somewhere in the house, Annie laughed at something on television. The sound, light and grounding. Ethan stood later at the edge of the garden, looking up at the darkening sky. For years, he had believed survival meant endurance, keeping his head down, letting time do the work. He knew better now. Survival meant confrontation. Inside, Lillian's voice drifted toward him, calm and sure. "Ethan, yes? I'm not invisible anymore," she said. "No," he replied. "You never will be again." And as he stood there, listening to the quiet life of the house behind him, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. The trial ahead would not just expose a crime. It would expose a system that believed power could erase people without consequence. That system had not counted on a woman who refused to disappear, or a child who refused to stay silent. The first day of the full trial began under gray skies. Ethan stood at the courthouse steps, coat buttoned against the cold, watching reporters gather like birds sensing movement. Their voices overlapped, questions flying before he had even crossed the threshold. He ignored them all. His attention was fixed on Lillian as she stepped out of the car beside him. She moved slowly but with purpose, her hand resting lightly on his arm. There was no hesitation in her posture now, no uncertainty in her eyes. Whatever fragments of memory still escaped her, something more solid had taken their place. "I'm ready," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I know." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restrained energy. Jurors filled their seats. Attorneys organized files. Daniel Harper sat at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, his confidence worn thin around the edges. He did not look at Ethan. He did not look at Lillian. That, Ethan realized, was deliberate. The prosecution opened with facts, not drama. Timelines, financial transfers, authority abused under the guise of necessity. They spoke of a man who had exploited trust and grief to consolidate power, and of a woman whose refusal had made her a liability. When Lillian's name was spoken aloud, Ethan felt the room subtly shift. Names carried weight, hers carried consequence. Lillian took the stand mid-morning. She adjusted the microphone once, then rested her hands calmly in her lap. The courtroom stilled, the way it did when people sensed something honest was about to be said. "I don't remember everything," she began, "but I remember enough." She spoke of the drive, the rain, the man who waved her down with concern in his voice. She spoke of waking in unfamiliar rooms, of being told she was confused, that the life she remembered wasn't real anymore. "They said my husband believed I was dead," Lillian said. Her voice did not shake. "They said it would be cruel to correct him." A murmur moved through the courtroom. "Did you believe them?" the prosecutor asked. "I tried," Lillian replied. "But grief leaves a mark. Even when you don't remember why you're grieving, your body knows something is missing." Ethan felt his chest tighten. The defense rose for cross-examination. Their questions were careful, pointed, designed to undermine certainty. "Mrs. Moore," the attorney said, "you admit your memory is incomplete." "Yes, and yet you claim to know the intent of my client." "I know the result," Lillian replied calmly. "I was erased." The attorney pressed harder. "Isn't it possible you misunderstood?" Lillian met his gaze. "I lived inside that misunderstanding for 3 years. When she stepped down, the courtroom felt heavier, as if something irreversible had been set in motion." Ethan testified after lunch. He spoke of trust, of delegation, of how grief had narrowed his vision until survival felt like enough. He did not deflect blame where it belonged to him. "I allowed someone else to make decisions in my absence," Ethan said. "But absence is not consent." The defense tried to frame his grief as negligence. "You weren't present," the attorney said. "You weren't paying attention." Ethan nodded once. "That's true. And someone took advantage of that. That is the crime." The final witness of the day surprised the courtroom, Annie Jenkins. There was a moment of hesitation as the bailiff opened the side door and the small girl stepped inside with her father. She wore a simple dress and carried herself with quiet seriousness. She did not look at the jury. She looked straight ahead. The judge leaned forward. "Do you understand the importance of telling the truth?" Annie nodded. "Yes. And do you promise to do so?" "Yes." Her voice was clear. The prosecutor knelt slightly to meet her eye level. "Annie, can you tell us how you met Mrs. Moore?" "She worked in the warehouse," Annie said. "She cleaned the old paintings. And how did you know she was Mr. Moore's wife?" Annie didn't hesitate. "She told me stories. About him. About their house. About how he didn't like the cold." Over. A few jurors exchanged glances. The defense attorney stood. "Objection. Hearsay." The judge considered. "Overruled. Continue," Annie went on, describing the woman who forgot where she was, who twisted a ring that no longer fit, who whispered a man's name like it was a question. "Did anyone tell you to say these things?" the prosecutor asked gently. "No," Annie replied. "Nobody listened when I said them before." The courtroom was silent. "And why did you decide to speak up at the exhibition?" the prosecutor asked. Annie shrugged. "Because she was tired, and because I thought if I didn't say something, no one else would." The defense attempted to challenge her reliability, her age, her understanding. Annie listened politely, then answered each question simply, without embellishment. "I know what I saw," she said. "I know who she was." When she stepped down, her father placed a hand on her shoulder. Ethan watched the exchange, something deep and steady anchoring itself inside him. As court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere outside shifted. The press no longer shouted questions. They watched, listened, took notes. Lillian leaned against Ethan as they exited the building, exhaustion finally catching up to her. "You did great," Ethan said softly. She smiled faintly. So did she. Annie walked between them, holding each of their hands without ceremony. That night, back at the residence, Ethan stood alone on the balcony, the city lights stretching out below him. The trial was far from over. Appeals would come, resistance would harden, but something fundamental had changed. The lie that had held for 3 years was cracking under the weight of truth spoken plainly. Inside, Lillian's voice drifted toward him, calm and certain. "Ethan?" "Yes?" "I remembered something today," she said. "Not a memory, a feeling. To a great Jazid." He turned back toward the room. "What kind?" "What? The feeling that even if they try again," she said, "they won't succeed." Ethan nodded. "They won't, because this time, the truth was no longer alone." The second week of the trial brought a different kind of tension. The shock had worn off. The story was no longer new. What remained was scrutiny, slow, methodical, unforgiving. Every decision Ethan had made over the last 3 years was examined under a microscope, stripped of context and presented as evidence of weakness, complacency, or convenience. Ethan felt it most during cross-examination. "You stepped away from daily operations," the defense attorney said, pacing slowly. "You allowed others to act in your place." "Yes," Ethan replied. "And during that time, critical decisions were made without your direct oversight." "That's correct. So when your wife was declared deceased, you accepted that conclusion." Ethan paused. The courtroom was silent. "I accepted what I was told," he said. "Because I trusted the people telling me." The attorney smiled slightly. "Trust is not a legal defense, Mr. Moore." "No," Ethan agreed. "But betrayal is a motive." End quote. The judge leaned forward. The attorney moved on. Lillian watched from the gallery, hands folded tightly in her lap. Each question aimed at Ethan felt personal, as if the defense were trying to prove that her disappearance had been inevitable, the natural consequence of neglect rather than design. During a recess, she turned to the prosecutor. "They're trying to make this about him failing," she said quietly. "Not about them choosing." "That's intentional," the prosecutor replied. "It won't hold." But Lillian knew better than to underestimate narratives. She had lived inside one for 3 years. That afternoon, new witnesses took the stand. Former employees, subcontractors, medical staff from the unlicensed facility. One by one, they described instructions received indirectly, payments routed through shell accounts, warnings not to ask questions. I was told she didn't have anyone. One nurse admitted that no one would come looking. Lillian closed her eyes. Annie sat beside her father, feet dangling, listening intently. She did not fidget. She did not look bored. Her attention never wavered. "Does this make you sad?" her father whispered at one point. Annie shook her head. "It makes me careful." That evening, after court adjourned, Ethan found Lillian alone in the residence library. She was standing in front of a shelf, running her fingers along the spines of old books, as if trying to recognize something by touch. "I used to read a lot," she said. "You still can," Ethan replied. She smiled faintly. "I know." Ethan stepped closer. "You're not starting over. You're continuing." She turned to face him. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Annie hadn't spoken up?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. The image rose unbidden. The warehouse, the dust, the quiet erasure that would have continued indefinitely. "Yes," he said finally. "Every day." "A1 so," Lillian nodded. "So do I." The next day brought the defense's final attempt to shift blame. They called an expert witness who spoke at length about memory unreliability, trauma-induced distortion, the fallibility of recollection. The words were polished, clinical, almost soothing. Lillian listened carefully. When the witness finished, she leaned toward the prosecutor. "May I respond?" The prosecutor hesitated, then nodded. Lillian took the stand again, unplanned, unprompted. "I don't remember every detail," she said calmly, "but I remember being afraid. I remember being told my life no longer belonged to me. And I remember realizing that forgetting didn't protect me. It protected them." The defense objected. The judge overruled. "Memory isn't the only truth," Lillian continued. "Presence is. And I was present when they decided I didn't matter." The courtroom felt suspended, as if no one wanted to be the first to breathe. Outside, public opinion had begun to shift decisively. Editorials questioned not just the crime, but the systems that allowed it. How many people, they asked, had been erased quietly because they lacked someone like Annie to speak for them? That night, Ethan found Annie sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm drawing the warehouse," she said. "So I don't forget." "You won't," Ethan replied. She looked up at him seriously. "Grown-ups forget on purpose sometimes." Ethan sat beside her. "You're right." The following morning, the prosecution rested its case. The defense followed with brief closing arguments, carefully avoiding the word accident. They spoke of misunderstandings, of overreach, of unfortunate outcomes. They avoided intent. When it was over, the judge dismissed the jury for deliberation. Ethan stood as the room emptied, his body tense but strangely calm. Lillian took his hand. "No matter what happens," she said, "they didn't win." He nodded. "They didn't." Annie joined them, slipping her hand into Ethan's free one. "Is it over?" "Almost," Ethan said. She thought about that. Almost is better than nothing. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the second afternoon, as gray light filtered through the courthouse windows, the bailiff announced they had reached a verdict. Ethan felt his heart pound, not with fear, but with a heavy, grounded anticipation. Whatever came next would be final. The jurors filed in, faces unreadable. The foreperson stood. The room held its breath. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan realized he was no longer bracing for loss. He was ready for truth to land. The courtroom was so quiet Ethan could hear his own breathing. The jury sat motionless in the box, 12 strangers who had carried the weight of other people's lives for days. The foreperson stood, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a firm grip on the folded paper in her hands. "We have reached a verdict." Ethan felt Lillian's fingers tighten around his. Annie stood between them, small hand wrapped in his coat sleeve, her face tilted upward, watching with solemn attention. The judge nodded. "You may proceed." The foreperson unfolded the paper, her voice steady but deliberate. "On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Daniel Harper, guilty." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Ethan did not move. The word landed heavily. not as relief, but as confirmation. Something he had known long before the evidence had finished speaking. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. Daniel Harper's jaw tightened. His gaze remained fixed on the table in front of him, as if looking up would fracture whatever control he still believed he possessed. On the charge of unlawful confinement and falsification of records, guilty. Annie squeezed Ethan's sleeve once, not hard, just enough to say she was there. When the four-person finished, the silence that followed felt different from the one that had come before. This silence was not suspense. It was finality. The judge thanked the jury and set a date for sentencing. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. 3 years of unanswered questions did not vanish with a verdict. But something loosened inside him. A tension he had carried without realizing it finally gave way. Lillian exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath for years. "It's over," Annie whispered. Ethan looked down at her. "The hardest part is, Daniel was led away moments later. As deputies approached, he finally looked up. His eyes met Ethan's for the first time since the trial began. There was no apology there. No plea, only the hollow realization of a man who had believed himself untouchable, now stripped of illusion. Ethan did not look away. Outside the courthouse, the air felt colder, sharper. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, voices overlapping. "Mr. 8, Moore, how do you feel? What does this verdict mean to you?" Ethan raised a hand. The crowd quieted. Slowly, "My wife was taken from me while I was still alive," he said. Today, the court acknowledged that truth. That matters. "And the child?" someone called out. "What about Annie?" Ethan looked down. Annie stood straight, unafraid, her small shoulders squared. "She did what many adults failed to do," Ethan said. "She told the truth when it was inconvenient. That's not something we should forget." They left it at that. Back at the residence, the atmosphere shifted for the first time since the trial began. The house felt lighter, as if it no longer needed to brace itself against what might come next. Lillian stood in the kitchen, staring out the window. "I thought I'd feel different," she said. "How so?" Ethan asked. "Victorious," she replied. "Angry. Relieved." She shook her head. "I just feel... here." Ethan stepped beside her. "That's enough." She nodded slowly. "Yes, it is." That evening, Annie sat at the table drawing again. This time, it wasn't the warehouse. It was a house with a wide porch, 2 figures standing close together, and a small stick figure between them. "That's us," she said when Ethan looked. He smiled. "I can tell. Do bad people always get caught?" Annie asked suddenly. Ethan considered the question carefully. "Not always," he said. "But they should." Annie nodded. "Then we did a good thing." His sound. "Yes," Ethan said softly. "We did." Later, after Annie had gone to bed, Ethan and Lillian sat together in the quiet living room. The city lights flickered beyond the glass. Distant but steady. "I'm afraid," Lillian admitted. "Of what?" Ethan asked. "Of who I'll be after this," she said. "I lost time. I lost pieces of myself." Ethan turned toward her fully. "You're not what they took from you," he said. "You're what survived." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise we won't pretend this didn't change us." Ethan wrapped an arm around her. "I promise." The verdict had closed one chapter, but Ethan understood now that justice was not an ending. It was a turning point. Accountability opened doors, but healing walked through them slowly. As he stood later that night, looking down the hallway toward Annie's room, Ethan realized something with quiet clarity. The truth had won in court. Now it had to win in life. Sentencing day arrived without ceremony. There were no crowds outside the courthouse this time. No shouting reporters or flashing cameras. The spectacle had passed. What remained was consequence. Ethan walked beside Lillian through the quiet corridor, their steps measured, unhurried. Annie walked a few paces behind with her father, holding his hand, her gaze curious, but calm. She had asked if she needed to come. Ethan had told her no. Lillian had told her yes. This is where endings happen. Lillian had said. And you helped bring us here. The courtroom felt smaller now, stripped of anticipation. Daniel Harper stood once more before the bench, no longer immaculate, his confidence reduced to stiff posture and clenched hands. He looked older than Ethan remembered, diminished by the slow realization that power, once exposed, evaporated quickly. The judge reviewed the charges with clinical precision: attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, unlawful confinement. Each count was read aloud, each one landing with a finality Daniel could no longer deflect. For crimes that demonstrate sustained intent and profound disregard for human life, the judge said. This court sentences the defendant to 23 years in federal custody. Daniel's shoulders sagged. For the first time, something like panic flickered across his face. Ethan felt nothing resembling triumph. 23 years did not restore 3 stolen ones. It did not give Lillian back her memories or erase the nights she had spent wondering if she had ever mattered. Justice, Ethan realized, was not balance. It was boundary. It said, "This ends here." As they exited the courtroom, Annie tugged gently at Lillian's sleeve. "Is he gone now?" "Yes," Lillian replied. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." Annie nodded, satisfied. "That's good." Outside, the sky had cleared. Winter light fell cleanly across the steps, sharp and honest. Ethan inhaled deeply, feeling something loosen inside him for the first time since the verdict. That afternoon, life pressed forward in quieter ways. At the residence, boxes began to appear. Documents returned from evidence. Personal belongings retrieved from sealed facilities. Among them was a small cardboard box, labeled only with a number. Lillian opened it slowly. Inside were things that did not belong in storage. A scarf she recognized immediately, worn thin at the edges. A paperback novel with a cracked spine. A folded note written in her own hand. She unfolded it carefully. "If I forget," the note read, "I want to remember that I loved him." Lillian pressed the paper to her chest, tears finally falling without restraint. Ethan sat beside her, silent, present. "I wrote that," she said softly. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad." "You knew enough," Ethan replied. "You left yourself a way back." Later that evening, Ethan gathered the board via video conference. Faces appeared on the screen. Tense, cautious. "I'm stepping down as CEO," Ethan said without preamble. A wave of reaction rippled through the call. "This is temporary, I assume?" one voice asked. "No," Ethan replied. "It's permanent." Silence followed. "I built this company on the idea that systems protect people," Ethan continued. "I was wrong. People protect people. And I lost sight of that." He outlined the restructuring: independent oversight, community representation, safeguards designed not for efficiency, but for accountability. "This is not about legacy," Ethan said. "It's about responsibility." When the call ended, he felt lighter than he had in years. That night, Annie sat at the kitchen table doing homework, her father beside her, helping quietly. Lillian watched from the doorway, something thoughtful in her expression. "She belongs here," Lillian said. Ethan nodded. "She does." They spoke later, after Annie had gone to bed, the house wrapped in a gentle hush. "I don't want her to go back to sleeping in storage rooms," Lillian said carefully. Ethan met her gaze. "Neither do I." The words that followed were not dramatic. They did not need to be. They spoke of guardianship, of stability, of choice. "We don't have to decide everything tonight," Ethan said. "I know," Lillian replied. "But I already know what I want." Ethan smiled softly. "So do I." In the weeks that followed, life rearranged itself. Lillian began therapy, the slow, patient work of reconnecting mind and body. Some memories returned in fragments. Others remained distant. Ethan learned to accept both outcomes without pushing, without demanding restoration on his own timeline. Annie started school nearby. She complained about math. She loved reading. She insisted on walking the same route every morning, just in case someone needed help finding their way. Ethan watched it all with a quiet awareness. Healing, he learned, did not announce itself. It arrived in routines, in laughter, in the absence of fear. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Annie leaned against him. "Do you still feel broken?" she asked. Ethan considered the question. "No," he said. "Changed." She nodded. "Changed is okay." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." Inside, Lillian stood watching them, a faint smile on her lips. For the first time since her return, the future did not feel like something to be endured. It felt possible. Spring arrived quietly. It didn't announce itself with celebration or ceremony. It slipped in through open windows, through mornings that no longer felt heavy, through the slow return of ordinary sounds, birds on the fence, a lawnmower down the street, Annie humming to herself as she tied her shoes. Ethan noticed it one morning as he stood in the kitchen, watching Lillian pour coffee. Her movements were steadier now, more confident. She still paused sometimes, still searched for words that hovered just beyond reach. But there was no fear in those pauses anymore, only patience. "I remembered something," she said casually, as if mentioning the weather. Ethan looked up. "Something good or something complicated?" She smiled. "Both." He waited. "I remembered the day you proposed," Lillian said. "Not the words, just the feeling. I remember thinking that even if everything went wrong, I wouldn't be alone." When today, Ethan felt a quiet tightening in his chest. "You weren't wrong." Annie burst into the room then, backpack slung crookedly over one shoulder. "Dad says I'm going to be late if I don't hurry," she announced, then stopped short. "You're smiling. Did something good happen?" Lillian reached out and straightened Annie's backpack strap. "Something honest happened," she said. Annie nodded, satisfied. "Honest is better." He toes. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ethan had almost forgotten how to live inside. Mornings with coffee and quiet conversation. Afternoons split between legal meetings and school pickups. Evenings where nothing catastrophic happened, and that, Ethan realized, was its own kind of miracle. But healing had a way of surfacing unfinished business. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Ethan recognized the handwriting immediately. Blocky, deliberate. The return address stamped from a federal correctional facility. He did not open it right away. He carried it inside, placed it on the table, and sat across from it for a long time, as if proximity alone might explain what it contained. Annie was at the table coloring, carefully staying inside the lines of a picture she had drawn of a house with a porch and 3 figures standing together. "Is that bad mail?" she asked, glancing up. "I don't know yet," Ethan replied. Lillian appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with one look. "From him," she said. "Yes." She came closer, resting her hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder. "You don't have to read it." Ethan looked up at her. "I think I do." He opened the envelope slowly. The letter was shorter than he expected. No apology, no justification, just a careful attempt at explanation. Daniel wrote about pressure, about fear of losing control, about believing he was protecting something larger than one person. He wrote that he never intended for things to go as far as they had, that circumstances had escalated. Ethan read it once. Then again. When he finished, he folded the letter neatly and set it aside. "Well?" Lillian asked quietly. "He wants understanding," Ethan said. "Not forgiveness." Annie looked up from her coloring. "What's the difference?" Ethan considered the question. "Understanding explains what someone did," he said. "Forgiveness decides what you do with it." Annie nodded. "Are you going to forgive him?" Ethan shook his head. "No." Lillian didn't flinch. "I won't either," she said. "But I don't want him in my head anymore." That night, Ethan burned the letter in the fireplace. Not in anger, in release. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the words disappearing into ash. Some things did not deserve space. Weeks later, the final civil settlements were reached. Assets seized, properties returned. Funds redirected to programs that supported victims of corporate abuse and wrongful confinement. Ethan did not attend the signing ceremony. He sent his attorney instead. Power, he had learned, did not need to be witnessed to be exercised responsibly. Instead, he attended Annie's school play. She stood on stage with a dozen other children, singing loudly and slightly off-key, her face lit with unapologetic enthusiasm. Ethan clapped harder than anyone. Lillian laughed beside him, the sound easy and unguarded. Afterward, Annie ran to them, flushed and triumphant. "Did you see me?" "Yes," Ethan said, "the whole time." That evening, as they walked home together, Lillian slipped her hand into Ethan's. "I want to do something," she said. "What kind of something?" "I want to speak," she replied. "Not in court, not to reporters, to people who've been erased." Ethan nodded slowly. "When you're ready." "I am," she said. The first talk was small. A community center, folding chairs, a modest crowd. Lillian spoke without notes, her voice steady. "They took my life without killing me," she said. "That happens more than we want to admit. But I'm here to tell you that being erased is not the same as being gone." "Oh." Ethan watched from the back of the room. Annie seated beside him, feet swinging. "She's brave," Annie whispered. "Yes," Ethan said. "She always was." As months passed, Lillian's confidence grew. So did Annie's sense of belonging. She no longer asked if she could stay. She assumed she would. One evening, as Ethan tucked Annie into bed, she looked up at him seriously. "You didn't rescue her," Annie said. Ethan paused. "What do you mean?" "You found her," Annie said. "But she was already there." Ethan smiled softly. "You're right." He stood later in the doorway of the bedroom he shared with Lillian, watching her read, the lamplight soft against her face. This quiet, unremarkable peace had once felt impossible. Now it felt earned. Justice had been loud. Healing was not. And for the first time since the accident, Ethan knew which one lasted longer. The dedication ceremony was supposed to be small. That was what Ethan had told the city council. The donors, the board that no longer reported to him. Small meant controlled, manageable. It meant not turning something personal into another spectacle. But when the day arrived, the park was full. Families gathered on folding chairs. Teachers stood near the back with students clustered around them. Social workers, counselors, volunteers, people who spent their lives in the quiet margins where no cameras ever lingered. They had come not for Ethan's name, but for what it represented now. At the center of the park stood a modest building, newly renovated. Warm brick, wide windows. A simple sign mounted above the entrance, the Annie Jenkins Center. Annie stood beside Lillian near the podium, twisting the strap of her dress nervously. "I didn't know this many people were coming," she whispered. Lillian smiled down at her. "That's because you don't know how many people needed a place like this." Ethan watched them from a few steps away, hands clasped behind his back. He still found it strange how full rooms no longer unsettled him the way they once had. The weight had shifted. He wasn't carrying grief alone anymore. He was carrying responsibility, and that felt different. The mayor spoke first. There were the expected words about generosity, about transformation, about community investment. Ethan listened politely, his attention drifting to the faces in the crowd instead. People nodded, some wiped their eyes. Others simply stood, arms crossed, as if daring themselves to believe this would last. Then Lillian stepped forward. There was no applause at first, just silence, the attentive kind. "I didn't plan to speak today," she said, her voice calm, unamplified. "But I was asked what this building should stand for, and I realized the answer was simple." She paused, scanning the crowd. "It should stand for people who were told they didn't matter," she continued. "People who were overlooked, erased, or ignored, because it was easier that way." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "For 3 years," Lillian said, "I lived a life that wasn't mine. I was fed, housed, employed, but I wasn't seen. And the most dangerous lie I was told wasn't that I was someone else." She met Ethan's eyes briefly. It was that no one would come looking. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I'm standing here because that lie was broken," Lillian said. "By a child who believed that truth mattered more than comfort." She reached for Annie's hand. Annie stiffened slightly, then straightened, lifting her chin. "This center exists so that no one has to wait for a miracle to be seen," Lillian finished. "It exists because silence should never be the price of survival." This time, the applause came slowly. Not loud, not theatrical. It built the way trust does quietly. And then, all at once, Ethan stepped up last. He didn't prepare remarks. He never had, for moments like this. I used to believe systems were enough, he said. That if things were structured properly, people would be protected. He shook his head slightly. I was wrong. A few people smiled. Others nodded. Systems are only as moral as the people inside them, Ethan continued. And when those people fail, it shouldn't take wealth or influence to correct the damage. It should take courage. He looked down at Annie. This building isn't named after a hero, he said. It's named after a witness. Annie blinked. What's a witness? She whispered. Ethan leaned down slightly. Someone who tells the truth about what they see. Annie considered that, then nodded. Okay, the ribbon was cut. The doors opened. People filtered inside, exploring rooms filled with light and color and simple dignity. Counseling offices, classrooms, a small library, a kitchen that smelled like fresh bread. Annie wandered through it all, wide-eyed. This used to be empty, she said quietly. Yes, Ethan replied. Now it won't be. That evening, after the crowd dispersed and the park returned to quiet, the three of them sat on a bench beneath a tree just beginning to bloom. Lillian leaned back, exhaustion settling in. I'm tired, she admitted. But it's the good kind. Ethan nodded. It always is. Annie swung her legs, humming softly. Do you think people will be okay now? Ethan considered the question carefully. I think they'll have a place to start. She accepted that. As dusk settled, Ethan felt the familiar pull of reflection. Not regret this time, but reckoning. The kind that didn't ask what could have been different, but what must be protected going forward. Later that night, as he walked through the quiet house, he paused outside Annie's room. The door was slightly ajar. She lay asleep, one arm flung over the edge of the bed, a book face down on her chest. He gently picked it up and set it on the nightstand. Down the hall, Lillian waited, leaning against the doorframe of their bedroom. She's changed you, she said softly. Ethan smiled. So have you. Lillian stepped closer. Do you ever think about the version of us that didn't survive this? Yes, Ethan admitted. But I don't mourn them anymore. She nodded. Neither do I. They stood together in the quiet, the past no longer pressing in, the future no longer threatening. What remained was something simpler and harder earned, presence, and that, Ethan knew, was enough. The house was quiet in a way Ethan no longer feared. It was early morning, the hour when the world seemed undecided about waking up. Pale light slipped through the kitchen windows, settling gently on the table where 3 mugs waited. Ethan stood at the counter, moving slowly, deliberately, grinding coffee beans by hand the way Lillian liked. It was a small ritual, but it anchored him. For years, mornings had been something to survive. Now they felt like something to inhabit. Annie padded in first, socked feet whispering against the floor. Her hair was a mess, her eyes still heavy with sleep. You're up early, she said. So are you, Ethan replied. She climbed onto a chair and rested her chin on the table. I dreamed about the warehouse. Ethan paused. What happened in it? Annie shrugged. It was empty. He nodded. That's a good dream. Lillian entered a moment later, wrapped in a cardigan, her movements unhurried. She stopped in the doorway for a second, watching them. There was something settled about her now, not healed in the simple sense, but whole in a way that came from acceptance rather than restoration. Coffee? Ethan asked. Yes, she said. Thank you. They sat together as the house filled with the familiar sounds of morning. A spoon tapping porcelain, a kettle clicking off, Annie swinging her legs beneath the table. Do you remember the first thing you told me when we met? Annie asked Lillian suddenly. Lillian smiled. You asked me why the paintings were always watching us. Annie grinned. They were. Ethan watched them, the ease between them no longer surprising him. Some bonds were forged by time, others by truth. Later that morning, they drove to the park without announcing it, without planning anything more than being there. The Annie Jenkins Center stood quietly at the edge of the green, its doors open, sunlight spilling across the entryway. Inside, a counselor greeted them with a warm nod. Children's voices echoed down the hallway. Laughter, argument, the sound of belonging. Annie stopped just inside the door, taking it in. "It smells like crayons and toast," she observed. "That's the best kind of place," Lillian said. They walked through slowly. A teenager sat with a tutor at one table, frustration softening into understanding. In another room, a woman spoke quietly with a counselor, her shoulders easing as if she had been holding herself together for too long. Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not pain this time, but gravity. This was what had come out of 3 lost years. Not just justice, not just exposure, but presence. Outside, they sat again on the bench beneath the tree, its blossoms now fully open. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Annie asked suddenly. Ethan considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said. "I wish you'd never had to see any of it." Annie shook her head. "I don't." Lillian looked at her. "Why not?" "Because then you wouldn't be here," Annie said simply. "And this place wouldn't be here either." Ethan felt something loosen inside him. Not guilt, not gratitude. Perspective. That afternoon, Ethan visited the cemetery alone. He hadn't been there since the memorial service 3 years earlier, the one without a body, without certainty. He stood now in front of the marker bearing Lillian's name, the dates carved into stone like a closed door. He knelt and rested a hand against the cool surface. "I believed you were gone," he said quietly, "and I buried a version of myself with you." He stayed there for a long time, until the air shifted and the weight he had carried there finally felt finished. When he returned home, Lillian was in the living room, sorting through a box of photographs. She looked up when he entered. "I think I'm ready," she said. "For what?" "To take my name back," she replied. "All of it. Publicly." Ethan nodded. "Whenever you are," she smiled. Now, that evening, Lillian posted a short message online. "No drama. No accusation. I am alive. I am here. And I am choosing to live openly." The response was immediate, overwhelming. Messages from strangers, from people who had been erased in quieter ways, from those who recognized themselves in her words. Annie read some of them aloud, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This one says she didn't think anyone would believe her either." Lillian knelt beside her. "I believe her." As night fell, the 3 of them sat on the porch, the day easing into stillness. Fireflies flickered in the yard, tiny points of light refusing to be overlooked. "Do you know what justice is?" Annie asked. Ethan smiled. "What do you think it is?" She thought for a moment. "It's when the truth doesn't have to be brave anymore." Lillian reached for her hand. "That's very wise." Annie shrugged. "Truth gets tired of hiding." Ethan leaned back, listening to the quiet hum of the world around them. 3 years ago, silence had been his enemy. Now it was simply space room enough to breathe, to notice, to choose. Inside the house, a framed photograph sat on the mantel. Not the old one, not the man who had once stared out unaware of what was coming. This one was new. 3 figures, no perfect pose, just presence. Ethan understood now that some stories did not end with justice. They ended with responsibility, and that was better. As the porch light flicked on and the night settled gently around them, Ethan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Not relief, peace, quiet, earned, and shared. And in that peace, the truth rested at last, not as a weapon, not as a burden, but as a home. The story reminds us that truth does not belong only to the powerful. It often arrives through the voices we overlook: children, the vulnerable, the unseen. Silence protects injustice, while courage, even from the smallest heart, can dismantle systems built on lies. The lesson is clear. Real justice begins when we choose to listen, when we take responsibility instead of comfort, and when we understand that loyalty to truth matters more than loyalty to power. In the end, doing the right thing is rarely easy, but it is always necessary. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.